some of the work we've been doing in the Surviving Sepsis campaign and the guidelines on behalf of quite a large number of people that have taken us on this journey. A quick disclosure at the beginning, I have been one of the co-chairs of the campaign, and I have signed up my name to the guidelines, and I've driven a lot of the work, so that you just have to take as read gives me a bias. But I've now handed over, and we have two new guideline chairs, Hayley Prescott from the United States and Massimo Antonelli, who are going to be driving this forward. So although I'm saying this is my view as to what might be happening in 2024 or 25 or 26, it's really up to them to where they take it. The Surviving Sepsis campaign has been going now for about 20 years. A number of people on the stage this evening were right at the beginning of this process. It was set up at the beginning to improve the awareness, the understanding, the education of sepsis, and to foster that spirit to drive increased research and better understand the data we have in order to improve patient outcomes. Broadly, the first set of guidelines were published in 2004, and they've been published on a roughly 4-year cycle ever since. We've seen an acceleration of activities through the campaign in the last 4 or 5 years, partly through COVID, partly through the recognition that the children are a slightly separate group, and there was a need to develop paediatric guidelines. But then when COVID came, clearly there was a need to develop guidance for COVID, and that slowed an awful lot of the adult sepsis work down. I think it's fair to say that the guidelines have quite significant and high impact. This is looking at the citations through Scopus for the guideline documents, and you can see in the red columns just how high the academic citations are, but also the actual impact they have into our everyday life and on our everyday kind of understanding. All of the guidelines citations are in the 99th percentile of similar documents. And if we look at the Altimetrics, which is a measure of how well they're quoted in terms of perhaps social media, lay press, news, journalism, again, they are very highly regarded in terms of getting impact out and getting message and getting people talking and debating these subjects. But it's fair to say that they have been criticised. There's been lots and lots of papers written, there's been lots of debates in institutions and organisations like this decrying some of the work that's been done. Requests to retire the campaign, retire the guidelines, to remove them. Many authors say that actually they're wrong and they should no longer stand. And so we need to understand some of what the criticism has been, some of what that rationale and the reasons and the rhymes for the problems are, so that we can try and address them. I think we can actually summarise a number of the concerns into a broad set of themes. There's a lack of appreciation sometimes that evidence-based medicine is a methodology. It's a methodology that selects or prioritises evidence that's come out of randomised controlled trials above others. That doesn't mean to say it's the only way we can look at evidence, but this is one of the methodologies that we chose to do it, and that will drive an output, and that will drive a series of recommendations as part of that process. There is clearly a tension between population-based approaches and precision-based approaches, and we see that coming through in a lot of the criticisms. I know that the recommendation is this, but I can do better for my patient at the bedside. That approach will harm my patient. My patient's got heart failure, it's a different patient. So it's a recognition that this is a population-based approach. It's almost a public health-based approach. And that's going to drive a lot of what we're talking. We're talking about developing recommendations that will probably improve the outcome for the majority of patients that you treat. That doesn't mean to say that you can't do something different or better for your patient at the bedside. There's been quite a lot of confusion between actually the development of the evidence-based guidelines and the bundles or the improvement methodologies that are used to improve performance. And they are separate things, and they are, by design, separate things. But that confusion has played into the literature and played into the controversy. And also there's been quite a lot of controversy over the lack of diversity in the panels that were chosen, especially early age. And some of the more modern, more recent iterations, we've tried to improve the diversity in terms of how these are looking. So I'm just going to take you through a few of the kind of aspects of the methodological things that we do, rather than the scientific and the recommendations. So what was different this time around in 2021? What do we do differently in reaction to some of these controversies? Well, there was far greater emphasis on diversity. Not just diversity in terms of gender balance, but also geographic representation, and also to make sure that the panels was more representative of the populations we serve. It was representative of all parts of the world rather than just a few parts of the world. We updated the methodology, and we'll come on to that in a few minutes, but what we really got stuck with was when COVID came down, and the emphasis and the push and the need and the ability for us to be able to react quickly clearly slowed down for all of the obvious reasons, and that meant that we didn't meet that 4-year timescale. So diversity of the panel. If I go back 15, 20 years, the panels were predominantly male, predominantly from North America, predominantly from Europe. And we've tried to address that, and we have successfully addressed that to a certain extent, but I think we've still got a long way to go. We've got far more female representation now, and we've got representation from all over the world. But when you step back, it's very male-dominated, and the majority of panelists still come from North America and perhaps slightly less Europe. We very deliberately tried to get people in from all economic aspects and all regions, but I think as we go forward, that's an area that clearly can be improved upon. The methodology to take evidence through to recommendations and guidelines is quite complex. There's a lot more to it than at face value you think through. It starts from that panel constitution, getting the diversity, getting the right level of subject matter experts. We very deliberately this time went out and got representations from patients and public to try and get their views into this so that we could weigh up their values of what they thought was important as opposed to sometimes what we believe is important as clinicians. We structured and we improved the way we evaluate the evidence. We took a far more structured way than taking that evidence through a series of analysis and developing recommendations. And then there's quite a significant part of this process in working through how we draft and write the guidelines so that it doesn't come across as a 30 or 40-page, very text-heavy document in a journal that no one ever reads, but actually becomes something that's a little bit easier to see and develop and understand, and the key messages can come across. So in 2021, we updated how we manage conflicts of interests, far more important looking at the academic as well as the financial biases, and these were actively managed as opposed to just declared. We took a far more structured way at evaluating what evidence we should be looking at, and I'll come and show you something about that in a few seconds. We went out to our patients and our public and we talked to them about what outcomes they thought were important. And sometimes it's about weighing up, well, if I don't mind a little bit of bleeding, but if that means that I have a bit of diarrhea, well, we can weigh some of that up. What about a bit of bleeding as opposed to a bit of pneumonia? Their views sometimes are very different to what we think the answer is. We professionalised the approach in terms of getting and hiring professional medical librarians. We hired evidence-based methodologists to take us through this process, and we brought those public panels into the conversation. So the first thing we had to do was to work out what questions we were going to ask. And this was the way we tackled it. We went out and tried to survey what practice was around the world. The idea was that we wanted to find out if everyone's doing the same thing because they believe the evidence is right, there's not an awful lot of value in us answering that question again. But if we're asking questions where actually there's significant variation or variability in how we're implementing and interpreting it, then that's something perhaps we could add value in to try and help. So you can see in this graph, what I've tried to put in, this table, what I've tried to put in is those areas which had the most variability. What criteria do you use to determine whether your patient's got sepsis? How do you define sepsis? How do you screen for sepsis? How do you use albumin? How do you deploy antibiotics? Is it a single or is it dual? What's your strategy for doing that? Do you use biomarkers? Do you use steroids? And you can see where we're going. So we were looking for variation, we were looking for uncertainty, perhaps because of the evidence or perhaps because there's no guidance, in order to try and reduce that variation and to try and support and help people move it forward. I think we should learn something from what's happened in the last 2 years in COVID. This was the COVID guidelines we published. And you can see we published them pretty quickly, actually. We got them out 28th of March, 2020. That's before many parts of Europe, the first wave had come through. Actually, when you go back and read them now, many of the guidance and the recommendations were actually pretty robust, and I think we had to learn some of that on the hoof as it happened. But what we then found was that the evidence accumulated so quickly that they needed updating really rapidly. There was no point in having a static set of guidelines that were there for 4 years and then revisited. When things are moving quickly, the guidelines need to have a more live-like, real-time update process. And that's something I think we need to learn for the adult guidelines. Is it time we move away from a 4-year cycle to actually having a little bit more of a responsive way of evaluating and updating the evidence when the new data comes through? I said we put a lot of effort and thought with the journals into how we present some of this data so that it wasn't too text heavy, and we used colors and we used graphics and we used icons, or just ways to try and pick out some of the key messages and to align that to some of the grading and the weighting of the evidence and the recommendations. And I'm not going to take you through all of these, but you can see here the green with the 2 exclamation marks is a strong recommendation as opposed to the blue with a star, which is a best practice statement. So we're beginning, or we're on that journey to work through how we can actually present data or present a lot of evidence in a way that can be interpreted and understood. So I'm just going to take you very briefly through the process for how we bring these things together. So this is a PICO question, or part of the PICO question. How do we, in adults with septic shock, should we use intravenous corticosteroids? First thing we do is get all the data out. The librarians take us through. You recognize the forest plots. I'm not going to take you through that in detail. We can assess that for the bias of the study, the strength of the quality of the evidence, in order to get us kind of a traditional kind of meta-analysis and systematic review. We then take that through a number of processes. We look at the studies. We assess it for risk of bias. We look at the data in the studies, whether they're consistent with each other, whether they're directly relevant. So is that studies that we're looking at from patients with septic shock, or are we taking it from other groups of patients and we're extrapolating it in, because clearly that's going to change the weighting and how we view it? How precise is the message? How precise is the data in the analysis? And that gives us an ability to weigh up the quality of the evidence, and then we can then look at that quality of evidence and work out what we're going to say about it. So we take the quality of the evidence, we look at whether it's desirable, what the desirable outcome and impacts are, and weigh that up against the adverse of things, because everything we do has got a quid and a yin and a yang, a positive and a benefit. So we were looking here at the desirable impact, seemed to be moderately good. The undesirable effects of the steroids were relatively small. The quality of the evidence was moderate. So probably it's an important outcome if it's an improved mortality that our patients would value, and the intervention probably favoured giving the steroids in this respect. Not particularly expensive. The resources required aren't great. Broadly, it's available in all parts of the world, so we've got an equitable distribution. So we can develop a recommendation that's got a weighting of the evidence. We know it's in favour of giving the intervention. We know it's not going to have significant or major impacts in terms of cost effectiveness, resource utilisation, and is pretty widely available everywhere we go. And then we try and translate that then through into recommendation, which is presented broadly like this, giving all of that evidence, trying to make the language as clear and straightforward as we can. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to summarise by saying what are the changes I'd like to see in 2024 or 25 or 26, Antonio. Thank you for reminding me. I'd clearly like to see more evidence. I'd clearly like to see some areas where the evidence base is improved so that we can actually develop more sophisticated, stronger recommendations. We can't do that until the evidence comes through. I'd like to see a better understanding of some of the precision-based medicine approaches and how that's going to impact on what we do. I think we saw that came through in COVID very quickly. We started using new biomarkers. We started losing genomics, whole genome sequencing, either as a host or as in the pathogen. How's that going to impact on what we do? I'd like to see that come through and that nudging of that literature forward, although I suspect the evidence is not quite there yet. We've got to increase our understanding of what our patients want. There's a great tendency we take that paternalistic view that actually we know what they want and we drive the recommendations and the guidance for them, but actually sometimes listening to them and having part of that process is of great value. I think we've got to continue that drive to increase the diversity. The panel needs to represent the patients and the populations that we serve. At the moment, it's too male-dominated, probably Caucasian, almost certainly too much from North America and Europe, when the majority of sepsis probably isn't in North America and Europe, it's in other parts of the world. So we need to listen to those views and bring them into that conversation an awful lot more. I think there is therefore thinking that needs to be done as to how we present that. The danger is, and we tried to do that this time, to try and take into account the lower middle income settings and drive that into the rationales and the text, but it becomes very, very difficult, because if you don't have a drug, clearly you can't do an intervention. Therefore, we need to think through perhaps, at least in the implementation of the guidelines, how that may differ for Africa to Southeast Asia to North America to Europe, and that may need a different way of thinking and approach to implementing that, because one size probably does not fit all. And last but not least, I think we need to improve the responsiveness that we have in developing these guidance to the emerging literature. I'm sure with COVID we've learnt that actually things can move quickly when everyone gets on with it, but now I think probably a 4-yearly cycle is probably too slow when we get new data coming through, and we need to be able to understand how we're going to respond and get that data out to the wider public and the clinical kind of fraternity so that we can actually move things forward. So I will leave it there. Antonio, John Lou, thank you very much.